Good morning, everyone. If anyone could grab last minute drinks and find their way towards their seat, we'll get kicked off here. Excellent. Well, welcome and thank you all for being here at our 2026 Outlook meeting. We hope you all find some good nuggets to take away that help you plan for the coming year. Just a few housekeeping items before we get going this morning. There are refreshments, pastries, that sort of thing over to my left. Feel free to help yourself at any time. And then the restrooms are out these doors and all the way across the lobby, just in case you need to find those. It's a little bit of a walk, so you'll get your steps in today. We will take a break mid-morning. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. Susan Stroud is the founder of No Bull Agriculture, an independent marketing intelligence firm known for clear, data-driven insights. With more than 15 years of hands-on experience in the U.S. grain markets, from country elevators to river terminals, she brings practical, real-world perspectives. A Texas A&M graduate, Susan is widely recognized for her straightforward commentary, featured in outlets like Bloomberg and Bar Chart, and for her expertise in renewable fuels and ag policy. So help me welcome Susan Stroud.
Thank you. Good morning. Are you guys excited? So this is kind of, I speak in a lot of different areas, and this one is near and dear to my heart because I spent most of my professional career as a merchandiser working with producers in this area. So in Southern Illinois, I was at ADM in St. Louis for 7 years and then Consolidated Grain and Barge in Cahokia for 5 after that. And then I've been on my own doing research and analysis on markets for about 5 now. So today we're talking about change, and as I've gotten into the speaking thing more, it's always like the presentation starts with change is the only constant, and then I always end up editing this kind of the subtitle to it. And so today we're going to talk a lot about policy, because policy ultimately shapes markets, and markets ultimately shape agriculture. So I gave a presentation similar to this a week ago in Minnesota, and after it was over, this lovely gentleman, Terry, came up to me and he showed me his notes, and I was all excited. I'm like, Terry was paying attention. He took notes. He didn't sleep. And then he shows me the first one. Like, oh, Terry, okay. I mean, you're not wrong, but... And then he showed me beans. Well, you're not wrong there either, Terry. And then it was the last one. He had a plan, kind of hopeless, but put the farm in solar. So I thought Terry did good. I'm excited to get to know Terry a little bit more because him and 3 of his other producer friends from central Minnesota are joining me on a 10-day trip to Brazil here in a couple weeks. So if Terry, Terry seems like, I think we'll get along just fine. So hopefully today it's not quite as, there was an older gentleman that stopped me right after I finished and he said, you should have just handed out tissues with the presentation. I'm like, okay, maybe I need to go a slightly different direction today. But either way, so back to policy. So I really like this quote because it really brings home a lot of things about what we do in ag. We're not in agriculture, or I mean, we are in agriculture, but we're really in the government policy business because policy has such far-reaching implications, both from a supply and a demand perspective. So let's kind of go back in history to the original policy that was really a game changer for ag. And that was the renewable fuel standard. And so that mandated, they brought biofuel mandates into the picture and it developed the US corn ethanol program. And so today, more than 1/3 of our corn goes into ethanol production each year. And you can see where it ultimately, if you compare it to 40 years ago or whatnot, it took demand away from feed, but kind of as an offset there, we also have distillers production because of it. Now, the thing that really gets the most attention when you talk about US corn demand, it's always exports. And I mean, part of it, I think, I'm a little biased because I spent a lot of my career export-centric markets, the river market, but also because exports are kind of what makes the difference. You have more bushels in any given year, more leftover bushels. Bushels are cheaper, you export more. But even though we have a record corn export program this year, it's still only 1 in 5 bushels of total US corn demand. So if you look at the evolution of global corn exports, the US is still the largest exporter of corn in the world. But when we saw the renewable fuel standard really alter or change the dynamics of US corn demand, we started keeping more corn here domestically for ethanol, and it opened up the door for emerging markets. So corn production in Argentina expanded, or I should say exports expanded. Corn production in Brazil really ballooned with double crop corn after soybeans, and that's their exportable supplies. And then Ukraine is really important too, because Ukraine exports about 90% of its production every year. And so when you see production issues in Ukraine, that creates a window of opportunity for more US bushels. That's what we saw last year, and we're seeing some of that again this year. When you look at planted area, you can see what happened with the renewable fuel standard. Suddenly, we incentivized more production of corn, and it was at the expense of beans. Let's see. In 2007, so when the RFS expansion quadrupled the ethanol mandate, farmers planted, a record amount of corn, and beans fell to a record low. And then we also saw that kind of replay during these trade war years. So at the same time that the US is focusing on corn more, we really that opened the door for Brazil to expand. And they expanded in a huge way. And you can see that line. So the US bean areas remained somewhat flat for the past several decades, and Brazil's area just continues to expand. And here's what that expansion looks like from overhead. So this is Mato Grosso, Brazil, and this is a time lapse that shows that increase in planted area. So a lot of this is the conversion of cerrado or pasture savanna land over into crop production. But over the last 25 years, Brazil has averaged an annual growth rate of 5% in planted area. So that's 5% each year. Now they're at the point that that growth is slowing, but it's still ongoing. And since the last trade war alone, Brazil's soy area has increased more than 30 million acres. That's an area larger than Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, and North Dakota combined harvested in 2025. Those are our top 4 area-wise bean states this year, and they've grown that much just since the last trade war. So what happens when you have expanded area and much larger production? By default, you begin exporting more. And so that expansion, it really fueled Brazil as being an exporting powerhouse. Brazil first out-exported the US on soybeans in 2012, and today they export more than double what we do every year. So as Brazil is presenting bigger headwinds and competition for the US, we have that as one dynamic. The other piece of it is that we have expanding crush capacity here in the US that's really pushed us. It's really provided a headwind for exports, because the more domestic demand you have, the higher value you have for bushels in the US, and it means that export markets have to pay up more to get the bushels that they need. So it provides a headwind. But US crush, it's set for its 5th record year in 25-26, and it's set to have more than 60% of total bean demand in the US this year. That's a 2-decade high share. One other thing that has provided a lot of challenges for US exports is we've been dealing with prolonged low water problems on the Mississippi, in the Ohio too, but the Mississippi is a little hits home for this room. So, yesterday, who was trying to arm up if you were trying to haul into St. Louis yesterday? unsuccessfully maybe, or today, because I know some facilities are closing early today. So all of that, we already had low water conditions, but all of that cold air can cause river levels to drop really fast. And that's what happened yesterday. They lost 2 feet overnight. And so it led to some groundings. Then you have to adjust fleets and things. And so it makes switching more difficult. And it's still going down again today. But the problem with this is that ultimately it increases transportation costs. So anytime that we have higher transportation costs to get those bushels, not from the farm to the elevator, but from the elevator all the way to the Gulf or wherever it's going for export, it means that it raises the price of US bushels for whoever else in the world's trying to buy them. So this has been one big headwind for exports. But one of the largest drivers is that we've had this tremendous build out in US crushing capacity. So this map here shows over the past 5 or so years, we've had more than 1 billion bushels of added crush capacity announced. That would be annual added crush capacity announced. Not all of these are coming to fruition. The build out in total is about 600 million bushels, but that is more demand for us here domestically in the US, and that helps offset some of the challenges that we've had with exports. The biggest driver behind this is none other than Arnold Schwarzenegger, who thought that you would come to hear about corn and beans and I would stand here talking about the Terminator. But he was the governor of California in the mid-early 2000s. And when he was governor, he commissioned the state's EPA to form the world's first low carbon fuel standard, so LCFS is the acronym, since we love our government acronyms here. No offense to my farm credit friends. So he told the state's EPA to come up with this program that legislates a reduction in the emissions of transportation fuels sold into or in the state of California. It matters because California, if it were a country, it would be the 4th or the 5th largest in the world. I think it's moved to 4th. It had always been 5th. But it's a $4.2 trillion economy, and so its legislative decisions have an outsized impact on the rest of us. Now, it's been a good thing for agriculture. Maybe this is the first time that there's been some sort of good come out of California policies for US agriculture as a whole. Because it created this boom in renewable diesel production, and that uses soybean oil, and that's kind of what set off this entire crush expansion. So today we are a little more than at the halfway point in that build out of 600 million bushels of added annual capacity. We have 115 million bushels of added crush coming online this marketing year. And I should say, if I can figure out how to go back, the biggest changes. So, right here in Illinois, aside from Inco Brasa in more northern Illinois, they're going through an expansion. Some of the biggest changes or most impacted states would be like North Dakota, for instance. They had 2 of the earliest, in fact, the very first new build, ADM and Marathon Petroleum. It's a joint venture called Green Bison and Spiritwood, North Dakota. That was one big one. CGB has a joint venture in Castleton, North Dakota also. Those 2 plants combined crush about 100 million bushels of soybeans per year. And when you look at the state of North Dakota, their annual production, that they produce about 200 million bushels on average a year. So that's a really big thing, a really big change for a state like North Dakota that normally would be very export centric. Of course, they're not this year, but you have something like that come in, it really alters the economics of production in those areas. So the biggest driver behind this, because you're probably saying, okay, so Arnold was the reason, the low carbon fuel standard is the reason that we're seeing increased crush capacity, but what does this really mean? The reason behind the boom in crush capacity expansion is because of margins. It's because the low carbon fuel standard and new biofuel demand for soybean oil drove prices up to record highs. So this is a longer term chart, and you can see we've settled down into a more normal level. We're quite a bit off of the highs from a few years ago. but we still remain about 50% higher than the long-term average when you look at soybean oil futures. Higher value for soybean oil that used to be the discarded waste product of the crush complex, it suddenly has new value, new crush margins or higher crush margins, and that's why you see increased capacity. So when we look at soybean oil demand here over the past few decades, renewable diesel and this biofuel boom, it started with biodiesel, but renewable diesel is different. I guess I should have explained that when I was busy talking about Arnold. Renewable diesel is, unlike biodiesel, renewable diesel is chemically identical to petroleum diesel. It's referred to as a drop-in fuel, meaning you can blend it up to 100%, unlike biodiesel that is a 20% max, and it tends to gel in colder temperatures. Renewable diesel, you can blend up to 100%, and so it really reduces the carbon intensity of the fuel. That's why you see a lot of it used in California. And because it's a drop-in fuel, it can be used in existing infrastructure and engines with no modification. So it was very quick there was rapid adoption of renewable diesel. So from that boom, you can see the green lines here. This is biofuel demand for soybean oil. And 2025-26, this marketing year, is the first one in history that USDA is expecting us to use more soybean oil for biofuel demand than for food demand. First time ever. Now, when we look at overall feedstock demand for biomass-based diesels, all that means is biodiesel, renewable diesel, what did we make them out of? So you see, if you go back 5 or so years ago, it was half and half or so. Soybean oil was the largest percentage share feedstock that we use. And as time has gone along and renewable diesel production has increased, coastal renewable diesel producers, hint, hint, California, they like to rely on low carbon intensity waste fats and greases and a lot of imported waste fats and greases that are inexpensive and they can make renewable diesel out of. So you can see the way that that has changed overall. So even though we're using record amounts of soybean oil to make biofuels, we've seen our market share decrease because of some of those changes. And it's not just us here in the US that's caught the biofuels fever. Biofuels are really redefining global vegetable oil demand. So this chart just shows the main 3 global vegetable oils: palm oil, soy, and rapeseed, AKA canola oil. And over the past 15 years, industrial, AKA biofuel use, it's grown at an average of 7% per year. Food use, on the other hand, has only grown at 3% per year. So that shows you where the real growth is, and it's biofuels, and it's not just here in the US. And for that reason, soybean oil now trades like an energy commodity. Now, it has its moments, and especially here lately, where we've had one reason or another that soybean oil kind of breaks away from the broader energy complex. But all in all, there's a very close correlation between the way that energy prices, this specifically would be diesel heating oil, moves and the way that soybean oil trades. Here's the really boring part. So if anyone's ready for that mid-morning nap, we're going to talk a little deeper about policy. So in US biofuels, we have 2 policies that are really the driver. And I'm sure that most of you have heard of 45Z, and you're probably like, again, we have numbers, we have letters, not terribly certain what it means. And then on the other side, we have the Renewable Fuel Standard. More recently, you've probably heard the 3 letters RVO more times in the past 2 months than you have in the past 20 years. And there's a lot of reason why. So looking at them separately first, 45Z, it really sets the economics for producing biofuels because it's giving incentives. So it is a tax credit for producing. The lower carbon intensity of the finished fuel, the higher the subsidy you get. And so that is why it is structured, or we look at it as, okay, well, soybean oil, a fuel made from soybean oil, is going to give you X amount of cents per gallon. A fuel made from let's say beef tallow is going to give you X cents per gallon. The other piece of it is the renewable fuel standard. And so the RFS, like what we talked about way back on the first slide or so, it mandates a minimum volume of biofuels that have to be blended into petroleum supplies. The way that, or the mechanism for compliance is a RIN. You probably hear a lot about renewable identification numbers. The way that petroleum companies comply with the renewable fuel standard, it's by two ways. Either they can blend the physical gallon of biofuel, and every physical gallon of biofuel in the US has a RIN attached to it. It's like a 40-digit long serial number, renewable identification number. So if you blend that gallon of biofuels according to the mandate like you're supposed to, the RIN is detached from the gallon, and that's how you show EPA that you're in compliance. So you can either blend the physical, or you can go out on the open market and you can buy the RIN. So there's two ways to be in compliance: physically blend it, or you can pay to comply. Right now, the biggest challenge with the renewable fuel standard is we are still waiting on EPA to give us the volumes that are mandated to be blended into US petroleum fuel supplies in 2026. So that's been one of the biggest hangups on the market. So the only for sure that we have right now is 45Z gives incentives based on carbon intensity of the fuel. And now we're waiting on the other piece of it, which is EPA to say, this is how much you need to blend, and this is how we're treating RINs. So on 45Z, big changes took effect in 2025 that were a negative, or I should say, let me back up. 45Z went into effect January 1st of 2025, replacing an old $1 per gallon blending tax credit for biomass-based diesels. It was a big shock to the system, and it was very negative for soybean oil because it took soybean oil as a fuel feedstock, its value, or the value for that fuel, from $1 to blend a gallon down to about 25 cents. So it was a really big negative as we started the year. But we've had an about face, and it was part of the one big beautiful whatever it was bill that Trump signed into law on the 4th of July. So beginning this year in 26, we took a very America First turn. So the first thing was, to get a 45Z tax credit for your biofuel, you had to make that fuel out of a feedstock that came from the United States, Canada, or Mexico. So that's one thing that's very good because it limits the amount of feedstocks that are out there. The other piece of it that's very important is they excluded indirect land use change. And that is a ding that has been put by EPA on crop-based biofuels, saying that if you are growing, we're using all this soybean oil to make biodiesel and renewable diesel out of. If we're doing that, it means that Brazil is going to have to plant more soybeans to be able to feed the demand that was displaced by the biofuel. So it's been a really a point that a lot of your grain and biofuels associations, they fought it very hard for a long time, and finally we were able to see a reprieve from it. And so it materially changes the economics of biofuel production with soybean oil, canola oil, and even corn ethanol here starting in 2026. So the way that we look at these changes comparing last year to 2026, if you see up there, US corn oil going into renewable diesel, corn oil is important. Distillers corn oil, suddenly distillers corn oil, that's a byproduct of ethanol production. It has a lot of value because it's considered a waste feedstock, and it commands a very high subsidy under 45Z. We have US used cooking oil, and then you have tallow. Now, one of the biggest changes here is because it's only US, Mexico, or Canada origin feedstocks, you see that making renewable diesel out of Brazilian tallow had gotten you a 65-cent credit in 2025 under 45Z. Now it doesn't get you any credit at all under 45Z because it's not part of North America. Now you can see the next set of bars over US soybean oil going to biodiesel, removing that indirect land use change penalty. It effectively doubled the credit that biodiesel that's made from soybean oil can receive. Same thing for renewable diesel, huge bump there. And then you see Canadian canola oil going into renewable diesel. Canola oil was excluded last year because the carbon intensity was too high, but removing the ILUC penalty puts canola oil back in the mix. Now you see imported used cooking oil, which has been a major pain point for a while now, as we were importing billions of pounds of it from China the past few years. Imported cooking oil, no matter, or used cooking oil, no matter the origin, it does not receive any credits under 45Z, and that's because the government has no way of validating that it is actually used. So it doesn't matter where it comes from, it doesn't qualify for a credit. And then you see US corn ethanol. Corn ethanol commands about an 11-cent per gallon credit now. If you back into the math, that's technically 25 cents or something per bushel of corn. But I guarantee you, if you call ADM Decatur and you're like, hey, you know what? Ethanol, it's getting a credit in 45Z now. I should have a little more to my corn basis. They're going to be like, no, I don't think so. All right, so that was 45Z. So remember, that's a tax credit that it's not a mandate. It's something voluntary, and it is designed to incentivize the production of biofuels in the US. Now, the renewable fuel standard, this is the piece that's the actual mandate, and this is what we're waiting on. So with the RFS, one thing is quite clear. We've been oversupplied and under-mandated, and the huge growth in those big green bars from 2022 through 2024, that is thanks to Arnold in California. It's because of renewable diesel. So EPA really underestimated California's movement to hop on the renewable diesel bandwagon. Lots of production, and the mandate did not move along in lockstep. And so that put us in a problem, or in a place where we had a problem. And so EPA's original proposal back in June for the 26 and 27 mandates, the implied volumes are substantially higher. It's like a 67% year-on-year increase from 25 to 26, and then a little additional increase to 27. It would align the mandate more closely with what we were actually producing. Farmers really took center stage in that June announcement from EPA. This is the first time the EPA has really put farmers in the spotlight. In fact, in most of these RVO proposals, going back to the original renewable fuel standard, farmer was maybe mentioned once, and it was always something to do with ethanol. So this is a really big change, because farmer was mentioned something like 8 times in the initial release from EPA. But what EPA is saying is they're concerned with the amount of foreign feedstocks like used cooking oil and, for instance, tallow from Brazil. It says it's maybe displacing US produced feedstocks like corn and soybean oil. It says American farmers are already struggling. These cheap imports are undercutting US producers and further harming the US farmer. So EPA showed their work with this. This is 2024. So this is renewable diesel and biodiesel. And you can see the columns are broken down here by imported feedstocks or domestic feedstocks. And that far column with renewable diesel, that's where the problem is because they were estimating that nearly 60 or imported fats, oils, and greases accounted for nearly 60% of biomass-based diesel production in 2024. So that's what was giving them the basis of making changes that shift us back to that America First energy policy. So in their original proposal, they're saying that any fuels that are produced or that are foreign derived, so produced from an imported feedstock, would only generate half of a RIN value. So if you remember back when we were talking about what a RIN is, a RIN is, remember, it's compliance. You have to pay to be in compliance with the mandate. You're either paying by way of blending biofuels, or you're paying by way of going out and buying a RIN. But what this does is it effectively dings anyone that is producing a biofuel out of an imported feedstock. I think one of the biggest challenges with this is that if you recall last week or so, there's this Reuters news report out that is saying that, EPA is going to hold up their end of the deal and have substantially higher mandated volumes of biofuels to be blended for 2026 and 27, but they're also saying that we won't see this 50% RIN haircut come to fruition because petroleum refiners are fighting it hard. I don't know exactly how we end up. It seems like today most of the market feels like this 50% ding is going away, which means that we still leave the doors open for imported feedstocks. I don't know exactly, I don't know what to think of it at this point because it kind of goes back to this message from Donald. And then again, we have this recurring theme with this administration, America first. Now, one could argue that he's not exactly putting America first in a lot of ways, but they keep spelling this out. And so I think this is going to be something that's really important to watch going forward as EPA makes final decisions on the RVO for 26 and 27. All right, so let's talk about trade a little bit. So China at this point, probably the most important thing to note about the deal with China is that the US has been the only one to actually call it a deal. We have not seen, and Treasury Secretary Besant, after they had their October 30th meeting in South Korea, the Treasury Secretary came out and said explicitly, 12 million metric tons of soybeans by the end of the year, and then it was 25 million metric tons each year after that. And then we saw them continually move the goalpost, kicking the can down the road from what was the end of the year turned into the end of the season, which he had no idea what season he was talking about. Then he said the end of February. But today, that first 12 million metric tons, which is 440 million bushels or so, those commitments are already done. China has made those purchase commitments. And now the focus turns to 3 years potentially of 25 million metric tons apiece, which for easy math, we'll just call that 1 billion bushels. The thing is that if you look back historically, we're still we've just gained our market back, I guess. In fact, we're not even back to pre-trade war levels at all. We're below the 5-year average. But nonetheless, the idea that China's back in the mix is supportive for the market. I think the bigger problem is that a near 40% increase in Brazilian production since the first trade war, that's really the bigger problem because the US has turned into a residual supplier. One big thing too is that China is a harvest buyer. So typically we will ship 50% of our full year export program in the months between September and February to China. So if you look at those white numbers up there, on average, 5-year average, we ship China 285 million bushels in October, 250 million bushels in November, 170 million bushels in December. Those are big numbers. And we missed September, we missed October, and we shipped them one boat, I believe, on the very last day of November. That does not cut it. And when you look at it, comparing September through December 2024, that's the US in blue. So that shows you how important US bushels are in September through December. And then the next column is Sep through Dec 2025. And Argentina and Brazil combined all, made up for all of the bushels effectively that the US did not ship during that time. The other big, or I should say the other challenge is the way that markets have moved throughout kind of, as we saw the trade war thaw. Once we saw the trade war thaw, we saw US values shoot through the roof, and they got up there fairly high where Brazilian values were. And then the problem is that Brazilian values have began to collapse because they have a record harvest, or they're in the middle of a record harvest right now. And US values were going the other direction. A lot of that is I think because we have a very reluctant producer seller who is ready to go out today and just and sell another big chunk of beans. I don't think anyone is. And part of the, you have a few different things going on. So you have that run up that we saw in prices mid-October to mid-November. I hope you made some sales then because we had a big opportunity. I think most people made sales, enough sales to be comfortable. And then we had the government come out and they announced the $12 billion aid package. And it's not that the 40 some dollars that you get per acre on beans or on corn, and I don't even remember what it is on beans. I'm sure someone in this room knows it to the penny. But it's not that farmers necessarily wanted it. It's not that it saves the farm, but it is definitely a Band-Aid for cash flow, and it leaves the farmer in a position where you don't really feel like selling. You have a little bit of added income here. You've already made a few sales, and you sure as hell don't want to sell at these levels. So what happens? Any Gulf exporter that's needed bushels, they have to keep paying up for them because they're not having any luck getting them. And then the other problem is they just had I have a good friend who is a commercial manager in a soy processing plant. Well, he was complaining. He's like, we have SIF beans, meaning what the Gulf is paying for barges of beans. At $1 over, he's like, I have to bid 50 over to get beans because nobody's moving beans. And then I have a good friend who is an exporter. She's crying to me on the next phone call that she's like, I can't get anybody to move beans. What's going on, And it's this back and forth. And these things, unfortunately, it's great that we have new crush capacity here in the US, but those are bushels that need to move every single day. And then we have this awkward export situation where no one's moving anything. And it just creates a lot of problems. So when we look at, and this is demand on average, because keep in mind that in the US this year, we're going to crush will represent about 60% of our overall bean demand. But exports to China on average account for 1 in every 4 bushels of US bean demand. So that means 1 in every 4 rows of beans every year in this country are exported to China. It's a big deal. So even though we have record crush, and we will continue to have record crush, it's not enough. It's not enough of an increase where it just suddenly takes the place of China. It doesn't work like that. And I put Brazil on here just because I think it's interesting. Who has a bigger problem? I mean, who ultimately has a larger problem? And I'm not saying that China and Brazil ever get into a spat. I don't see that happening, but they are much more reliant on Brazil's business than we are. So as we've had incredible challenges with bean exports, so combination of more crush capacity here in the US, Brazil is just running us over, unfortunately, because they are the least cost provider to the world. We've seen US exports drop off, but we've seen exports of US soybean meal continue to break records. And that is a trend that it's not something here just isolated to us, but it's really a growing world appetite for meal. And one of the biggest drivers behind that is because you have expanding crush capacity, not only here in the US, but you also have expanding crush capacity in Brazil too. So those two combined are effectively flooding the world market with meal to the point that it makes it more cost effective for a lot of these countries, let's say Europe, or for example, it makes it more cost effective for them to actually import inexpensive meal that's coming out of the US or Brazil, more so than buying the beans to crush themselves. So this is a shift that we've seen. So when you look back, since 2022, world meal imports have increased 25% from their prior 5-year average, and non-China soybean imports have only increased 15% during that same time. So speaking of record exports, let's talk about corn. So we're making US corn exports great again, and as much as I think this administration would like to take the claim for record corn exports and trade deals, it really doesn't have anything to do with that at all. we have a lot of bushels in the US, and the way that we've seen things shake out in other major exporting nations, it's really opened the door for us the past few years. And then the trade war with China leaving a lot of open capacity that's not filled by soybeans to China, it's provided additional opportunity. And one thing that is important to, if I can remember, there we go. One thing that's important to note here, so these are September through December cumulative export sales on the left. So you can see record amount of sales. The one that really sticks out though would be inspections. And that's because we have a tremendous amount of corn bushels, a lot of front-loaded business that's going off of the P&W. And a lot of this goes back to Ukraine. What we're about to reach the 4-year anniversary mark of Russia invading Ukraine. It's still ongoing. It's still more logistical challenges than ever before, messing with it's not just port infrastructure, but I think it's internal rail infrastructure and things too that are really negatively impacted. Plus, they had a really wet harvest, a late harvest this year. And traditionally, they are a fall shipper, kind of like we ship beans in the fall. They ship a lot of corn, and they've ran into major challenges, and it's left the door open for U.S. exports. So this is, we will take headwinds anywhere else if it gives us a tailwind, right? So we could call this winning by default, but I don't want to be quite that mean. But when you look at the major exporters, so Brazil, Argentina, Ukraine, and the US, those combined are about 90% of world corn exports every year. So when you have a problem in one of those other three, it can be great for the US. Brazil has seen a few ongoing challenges. One big boost there is that they had this tremendously fast-growing domestic corn ethanol program, which we'll hit on that in just a second. Argentina, and then Ukraine again, what I just mentioned. And so you have very tight stocks in those other exporters, and it's really helped pave the way for US bushels here the past couple of years. Now, looking at corn production year on year, the change by state, and you see where those biggest increases were. It's a lot of those western and northern states that are feeding the Pacific Northwest exports. So China wasn't there all fall to buy beans, and it provided a lot of opportunity for US corn. And again, we've been competitive versus Argentina and Brazil into Asian markets. And this has been one of the things that's really helped support those record corn exports. Now, Brazil, they have their own, kind of like we have our soy crush capacity boom here in the US, they have their corn ethanol boom right now. So for the most part, they have this growth rate of about 25% year on year going right now. So it's a very small program. You can see this is monthly amounts of corn used in ethanol. And so it's very small compared to what we have here in the US, but it's growing and it creates competition for exporters. And it has been a tremendous headwind. So while we have all of these challenges on the bean side of things, we should be giving Brazil a standing ovation for, at this point anyway, for their increased corn ethanol production. And here in the US, you've heard a lot about E15 lately. E15, your trade associations have been trying to gain momentum with E15 forever. The big challenge with us getting anything past this 10 point whatever percent blend rate that we've been stuck on for a decade here in the US is because big oil owns the pump. And every gallon of ethanol that you are blending into gasoline supplies, that's one less gallon of petroleum gasoline that the big oil company is able to sell. So that's been the biggest challenge. But to put it in perspective, every 1% increase in blend in the US, it's added annual corn demand that's comparable to the size of North Dakota's entire crop every year. But blends are getting higher. I know we broke the 11% mark nationally in, I think it was October of 2025. So we're moving the right direction. It is just a very slow process. Looking at our burdensome, big, beautiful corn crop. And so the biggest challenge, especially with last Monday's report, is that we found acres. We didn't see a drop in yield whatsoever. We saw a half bushel or something like that uptick. We're stuck with that now. This is the last supply adjustment that USDA will make this crop year. Sometimes they will make a very small tweak at the end of the year, but for the most part, we are stuck with a 17 billion bushel crop. The bigger challenge is that, normally it's like, well, demand will do the work. Low prices cure low prices in the form of new demand. But we've had low prices, and it's already been trying to cure low prices. We have a record corn export program. We also have a really big ethanol number that's already printed. That's, even though we've had record production here lately, it's still kind of maxed out. So we have, I don't want to call it inflated demand, but we have demand that's large enough that I don't really see a situation where USDA comes in unless there's some massive stock surprise. Yes. Yeah, and the biggest difference between one thing to point out, because you're like, wait a second, she was talking about Arnold Schwarzenegger and all of this good momentum I know I pick on Arnold a lot, but you'll never forget it though. Next time you see a soy crush plant, you're going to be like, Arnold, okay, the Terminator. But that move, that was really in this crush capacity boom in the US, that's the first time that we've seen big oil and agriculture actually aligned. So you have ADM and Marathon, a joint venture. Shell Rock in Iowa, Phillips 66 is a minor stakeholder. Let's see, Bunge and Chevron. So you have, because big oil realized the possibilities and following the dollar that is tied back to California's low carbon fuel standard. But on the ethanol front, it's a completely different battle. Big oil, ag have been against each other from the beginning. And hopefully we're eventually able to see some concessions where we see E15 take hold. Now, the other thing to mention is that we do have, year-round E15 approved in, what is it, 8 states, I think. I don't think that the year-round mandate everywhere, or I don't think that the nationwide piece of that is done yet. But, and now I don't even remember what I was going to say. Oh, it's that, it's a slow adoption. We're starting to see some states, for instance, like Iowa, have a much higher blend rate. It's slow to happen. The problem though with Iowa is that Iowa doesn't have, it's not densely populated. So you're not using a lot of gas. One big thing is paying attention to what's going on in California, because E15 has made its way there. So that's where you see things moving the needle. The other piece of ethanol, and especially with this record production, it's because we're seeing a huge resurgence in US ethanol exports to Canada, who has their own clean fuel program going on. Also India, you see increasing mandates again around the world, especially in countries that are harder to electrify. So there are opportunities that way for ethanol. But yes, domestic demand is probably one of the more painful and challenging things about the corn market. So if we're looking at 2026, talking about acres, are we headed for another corn-heavy repeat? The blue line there shows what we saw last year, and it was that the market was screaming, we don't want your beans, you better plant fence row to fence row corn, and that's apparently what we did. So you have that lingering US-China trade fallout. Where do beans go from here? And then we have strong corn demand, but we're going to have to continue to see corn demand, although January's little USDA surprise that clearly narrowed the gap between corn and beans. So profitability this coming year, it's another year of which crop loses the least or less. So year on year, this is Central Illinois pulled from Farm Doc. But you have another year where maybe beans are break even, maybe they look marginally better than corn. Do we still see big corn acres? Because ultimately the US farmer likes to plant corn. But we're at a point where corn profitability has rarely been this poor. uh, when you look at it from a cumulative loss perspective. And so it's not just the 2025 crop, but it goes back before that. And the biggest problem is that you still have extremely high input costs that are near record highs. But even so, corn does remain one of the least bad options. So especially when you consider like Delta areas, Mid-South, that kind of thing. So you have cotton and rice that look much worse than corn. And then when you get into more northern states, spring wheat also looks very poor compared to corn. And if we go all the way back here, my theory is that these states that saw tremendous corn yields and had a lot of success planting corn in 2025, there's a good chance that they're still leaning heavy corn again. Because what do you want to do? You want to repeat. Corn made you feel like $1 million last year, maybe not $1 million, but so farmers have a tendency to lean the direction that returned the best most recently. So to kind of sum it up here, on the corn side of things, we definitely have a supply problem. That big supply, it's set in stone, and demand has to do the heavy lifting, but we already have really big demand numbers, and so we have to keep seeing that. Otherwise, the market's going to look out and be like, oh, you know what? We're probably going to plant a lot of corn again next year. And so carry out from 2025-26 becomes your carry in and ultimately will weigh on new crop. On beans, it's a demand problem because although crush is a record high and we may still squeeze a few more bushels of demand out of it, it can't replace business with China. So we have another record Brazilian crop that's in focus. And then again, China has never officially confirmed any sort of deal, much less signed anything. There's no numbers behind it. We're over here just waiting on Washington to kind of give us our next move and signal. America First energy policy, the administration has really refocused its support for farmers on that because that is their alternative to business with China. And they've made it very clear that they want to pivot to more domestic demand. The problem is that we're in this weird pain point where it's like, well, we have this huge amount of demand that theoretically has been lost. Now, what are we going to do if we don't have enough domestic demand that can kind of take up those extra supplies? Feedstocks, so soybean oil in particular, trade like energy commodities. And it's not just here in the US that we have larger biofuel mandates, but it is a worldwide situation. And markets can always handle change. It's not comfortable, but markets can handle change. We just can't handle prolonged uncertainty. And that's what's happened with biofuel policies, especially the past few months. And then again, trade uncertainties. The path of least resistance is generally lower when you have a lot of unknowns ahead. I don't think anyone fell asleep. I'm proud. So does anyone have any questions? Happy to entertain questions as long as they're not hard. I felt like you were going to ask me one, and then it's going to be a hard one. I'm calling on this guy right here. I'm volunteer him. I am not qualified to answer that one. So if you're speaking of export sales where some will go into unknown, yeah. So I don't know. It is allowed though. Well, and I know that, a lot of people they see unknown and they're like, oh, that's China. It's certain export elevators. It is their protocol or trading desk to report unknown. That's exactly right. Yeah. Um, Yeah, so we've seen, I think, some discounts and rebates from railroads moving uh, moving things west to try to uh, pump up the volume. But to answer your question as far as quality goes, so you've probably heard Sino-Grain mentioned quite a bit here the past few months as China's returned to the US market. So a lot of the business that China likes to do with the US is Sino-Grain, which is its state reserve stocking company. They like to put US beans into reserves because they store better. We have a lower oil content than Brazil typically. Now our meal has a higher protein. We have a higher protein content, but we have a lower oil content that's better for storing. And so that's why we've seen Sino-Grain and they're restocking for that 12 million or so. I could not answer that question either. Well, so initially he was asking about the quality of US soybeans compared to other origins. And so US soybeans, a lot by China, they're bought for stocking purposes because we have a lower oil content. So they tend to store for longer periods better than Brazilian beans. Did anyone else have questions before we wrap it up? Oh, I hate that question. So he asked if
Can
I,
can I have him repeat that real quick, just so everyone can?
yeah.
I just said if you had any 2025 soybeans left to sell, what would your advice be?
Well, it depends what percentage you have left. If you're the guy that has barely sold anything, and I mean, I had looked at one point earlier today, beans were up 10 cents. Well, they're worth 10 cents more today than they were yesterday. So maybe you should sell a little something. Um, probably a few of you are like, this is why she got out of merchandising. She's not good at it. I think the thing that I have seen the most, or the one of the biggest problems with producers, is that you end up really, and I'm sure I won't ask anyone to raise hands, but I'm sure there's a few of you in here that you have that moment where you're like, oh, the market just tanked and I hadn't done anything. Or why do I still have 70% of my old crop beans? Or what do I do with this 2/3 of my old crop corn left? And you get so burdened by that that you miss opportunities for the next year. So I'll start by saying that make sure that you're paying attention to what's happening in a new crop because you can get just so sidetracked with those bushels that are in the bin that you don't know what to do with, that when we start to see a rally or something, you're so preoccupied messing with those that you forget about opportunities for new crop. But with that being said, on the bean front or anything else, I mean, one thing about it is we keep throwing negative things at the market and we really haven't broken that hard. I mean, yes, beans are way off of those highs in mid-November. But I think we've found this spot. We know that this big Brazilian crop is on the way, but we haven't broken, we don't have $9 beans. So I think small wins, especially if you're really undersold, you just have to start chipping away at it. it's probably past the point that you would get into averaging type programs or anything like that with an elevator, for instance. But sometimes making yourself get into things like that can be the best thing for you because it actually forces you to make some sales. So, it's amazing how fast we go from I sold too soon to I didn't sell enough, and then it'll be back to I sold too soon. And, you just have to kind of keep it in perspective and begin making more business-minded decisions instead of the fret, oh, what if it goes up 15 cents tomorrow? Because if it goes up 15 cents tomorrow and you sold today on the up 10 day, you didn't lose 15 cents. It means you made a sale that was 10 cents higher, and then you're going to wait a little bit and hopefully make another sale. I know that was a horrible answer. You were looking for me to say we're going to $11 in short order and then you should sell them all, but that was not what I said at all.
I think it was an 82 or 3. You can go back and look at the balance sheet. We were a 50% carryover in a crop that we raised. You can't keep moving towards that figure here and get anywhere with this unless you figure out a way to use this stuff up and consume it. And people won't like to hear this, but livestock and exports over the history of 40 years, it's been a flatline sideways move. It hasn't been an increase of 5.5 billion bushels of use. It's ethanol has kept us here growing corn in the last 20 years. And that's the savior out there waiting for us to do something with here. You go to E15 nationwide and force that on them and make them do that. You can burn it in every car that's been built since 2001, I think. And you don't have to change any equipment, but you'd have to increase the amount of corn you raise by 50% to cover it. And that doesn't happen overnight. So carryout's where it's at. We keep climbing like it. You can't grow 300 bushel corn all your life without having a plan on what we're going to do with it. Okay. Just you young people got to think about that. Okay.
Yeah, I don't.
Thanks for putting up with me.
It's okay. I've been heckled worse. So, yeah, I don't disagree at all. But again, it goes back to a mandate. And at the end of the day, you have to look at what the resources that petroleum lobbyists have versus the resources that your ag biofuels lobbyists have. It's not even in the same ballpark. That is the biggest challenge. I do hope that I think that industry groups, the National Corn Growers, Growth Energy, Renewable Fuels Association, I think a lot of those groups, they are leaning into our 17 billion bushel crop hard, and they're leaning on an administration that has been, although it's been a very painful and rocky past year, depending on the day, I think that it's an administration that ultimately they're trying to put the farmer back in the spotlight, no matter if you agree with the way that they're doing it or not. So hopefully we're able to move the right direction.
Susan, can we do one more and we'll wrap up on time?
Sure.
Thank you. I'm Roger Ward. I farm, and I'm also a farm broadcaster. On the government reports, I think the other day I understood most of those western states, the survey response was 40%. I got a survey that I filled out, and I'm just wondering in here how many people actually filled out any of the surveys and when the last one was filled out. The one I got was the end of September. Wanted to know what stocks we had on farm, what our production was going to be. Then the government shut down. I did not get any other survey to fill out for the grain stocks per se as December 1st or what my final production was. Does that mean that that's why I guess I'm wondering how many people filled a survey out for the government reports, say, end of November for December stocks and then eventually final production numbers?
Well, I think that one of the biggest challenges with accepting this report is that there are a lot of questions because, we have harvest and probably the most important yield data collection period of the year during that time that we saw the longest US government shutdown in history. And so that definitely brings, it's concerning that we might eventually see some sort of adjustment. But today, and I mean, I can't answer your question as far as the survey piece of it goes. I don't disagree. You also have to remember they're using FSA certified acreage, which a lot of people will argue, why didn't we have all of those numbers, those final numbers much earlier than January? But eventually maybe we see a correction, but I don't think that it's anything in the near future. Most of the time, if you're going to see some major adjustment, they will stuff it into the feed and residual category toward the very end of the marketing year. And so you'll see some sort of adjustment made there where they're somewhat backing into their math.